When I was at high school, I attended Southend High. And I remember when I was there, I had a head teacher called Miss Tribe. And she used to come out on stage with her sort of, I don't know, slightly sausage legs and a cloak and a mortarboard hat. And whilst I was at school, I wasn't aware of it at the time, but there was a strong message that us girls were given, which is you can do it all. You can attain very highly educationally, and you can balance that with bringing up children. And that was the indoctrination that we received. And at the time, obviously, I wasn't aware of that. So that's sort of how I went into the world, into working life. I was going to attain highly in my work life and also have children because as a child, I always wanted children, and that was very important to me. So, anyway, getting out there with work, because of how I am wired, um, I decided to go into mental health nursing. Very quickly, I'd had enough of education in terms of the sitting down aspect of it. And I thought, what else can I learn in a sort of dusty room about psychology? Let me just do mental health nursing. And actually, through meeting people and working with them, that is the real way I would get a feel for that kind of subject, because I had been weighing up whether to do English literature or psychology as well. But mental health nursing became my focus. So I went in to study that, and that meant that by age 18, I was out doing placements at different hospitals and, really just having to essentially deliver in life and be, I suppose, very dependable and responsible. So, age 21, I was working in Godden Green Hospital uh, with mums with mental health issues and babies. And yeah, it's a really, really responsible position there in terms of I was often looking after an entire ward of people with various mental health issues, and of course was responsible for supporting the nursery nurses and making sure the babies were cared for. But I've come to sort of see that really in my working life, I have been a huge addict to stress hormones. In mental health nursing, you get a lot of um, crisis situations, people absconding, people needing to be uh, well restrained. It's probably not really the word that's used anymore for it, but essentially that's it. A lot of like really on the edge stuff. And so from Godden Green, where I then worked in sort of like the acute mental health department with people that were very ill with things like manic depression and schizophrenia. I then shortly after that got a job at not Godden Green, at Springfield Hospital in London with deaf children who had mental health problems. And there I learnt sign language and again sort of really lived off of my stress hormones. So that meant when I came home, I would find it difficult to fall asleep and would quite often be wired, either thinking about my responsibilities for the next day or, finding it difficult to process some of the events that I'd gone through. And then after that, I worked in Brixton in the drugs field, so the substance misuse field. And met all sorts of people through doing that job. And again, essentially, it's a job dependent on your stress hormones, doing a lot and feeling under stress. So there I had a caseload of 30 people that I was responsible for. Again, all in all sorts of different situations. So there I was, addicted to my own stress hormones. I then got a job in the youth offending team in Brixton. And it was while working there that I was pregnant with Tristan. And initially, when I was pregnant, I was slow to tell my colleagues. And I had been doing really well in that position. I was visiting prisons around the country and finding the job really fascinating. I was wondering what value sometimes we can bring to young people who are in very difficult situations, but overall, I did enjoy the role. But eventually, I had to tell my manager I'm pregnant. And from there, really, what happened was the job that was on the horizon for me then disappeared. It dissolved. And I really found pregnancy utterly terrifying. I felt so kind of unstable and unsure, about maternity pay. How was I gonna live and survive? Um, yeah. And so that feeling really went through the pregnancy, even to the point of the actual birth. So leading up to having Tristan, I'd been so busy at work that I hadn't really planned. You're supposed to do like a plan for your labour. I hadn't really done that properly. But what I did do was some hypnotherapy on myself and Tristan, and I used to, connect in with him and be very calm and really, really focus in on the labour itself going okay. But because I was a nurse, I had an innate mistrust of hospitals. So when I went into labour with Tristan, I listened to a audio book called Jack Kerouac's On the Road. It's a classic novel. And I got through the labour as far as I possibly could, so that by the time I reached the hospital, I was ready to give birth. And that meant that I could avoid hanging out when I didn't want to. So I have Tristan. Now I had to stay overnight because I had to go on some antibiotics. Because as Tristan, as I was giving birth to him, Tristan, I think, did a poo on the way out or something. So I think we both had to have some treatment as far as I can remember. But anyway, pretty much as soon as I could, I had my bag packed and I wanted to leave. I didn't want to be in hospital. I didn't like the environment. I found it too, cold, clinical. And so, yeah, I made sure I sort of got out of there ASAP. And I think that hasn't been helped because of being a nurse. I often notice, like, say, if somebody does my blood pressure, I will pick up if they're doing it wrong and stuff like that. Yeah, which means I've got a little bit of a distrust, I guess. Anyway, get home. And it was in the height of summer that Tristan was born. And literally 4 days after having him, I was on a bus travelling into central Brixton to go to the library, okay? And it's only later on I've come to recognise that maybe a lot of people will be resting. Um, but really after that, after having him, that sort of feeling of sort of stress and anxiety about how I was going to do this continued. So I then got a job at the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service in Brixton, and that felt like it was a little bit more manageable because it was a community job, kind of more 9 to 5. Felt like something that I could cope with a child. So I loved that. It was a really, really cool job. Um, and that went okay. But I was always feeling like about, am I going to earn enough? How am I going to do this? How am I going to, be this perfect mum and be this career woman? Uh, Later on, I then changed jobs again and worked at the Raphael Medical Centre. That was in Kent, and that was on a brain injuries unit. And unlike the job in Brixton, in the community job, this one, even though they used anthroposophical medicine, some more natural medicines as well as Western, the hospital itself really ran just getting you to work as many hours as you could. They just worked you. And I was a team leader there, and I'll be doing 12-hour shifts and sometimes be asked to do more. And I mean, the hospital was crazy as well. But there came a point where I just cried to my manager, because how could I balance this career that was so responsible for people with brain injuries, that cause themselves damage through alcoholism, um, just general like road accidents and things, and people with dementia, people with diabetes as well, actually. How's I going to balance that with a small child? How was any of it really doable? When I was at work, I was having to rely on my parents to help. And became a stage where I really thought, you know what? I can't do it. So I left. And obviously this was at the stage where Tristan's needs were just becoming unavoidable. And the whole thing, I just thought, it's untenable. Do I continue in this career and put that first and my identity within that? Or do I focus in on this little boy who needs me? And obviously I made the decision to, park it there with nursing. And I focused in on Tristan's needs, which were becoming very obvious. He was becoming obsessed with the direction he went in the pushchair. Bashing his head, all sorts of things. So I stopped. And then came with stopping for somebody like me, the difficulty with coming to terms that being a carer and putting that first is actually really, really boring. It's full of routines and admin and housework and focusing in on things that feel so everyday, samey and invisible. And so really over the years I've struggled with that, this balance between what I was indoctrinated with at school, and then motherhood. And so then I've gone on to have two more children. And in that time, really, I've continued to feel the same anxieties. When my middle son was born, Tristan was then really, really developing his autistic behaviours, and he was all over the place. And then my middle son was just a little tiny baby, and he developed a lactose intolerance, and he was so angry. It was like for him, he didn't even want to be a baby, particularly he just wanted to grow up. Fortunately, I got to the bottom of what was causing that anger. As I say, this pain he was in through the lactose intolerance. But yeah, being a carer and managing this feeling all the way along of how do I keep this going? How do I provide? How do I bring them up to be really, really good men in the future? And all of this just goes through my mind all the time now. How do I give them what they deserve, bring them what they deserve? And yeah, I have felt so overloaded with that. One important break I got was when I volunteered for a Better Start Southend. So, having not worked for a bit when the boys were small, I really suffered from this feeling of invisibility. And when I volunteered for a Better Start Southend, I did help on a project, or pretty much drove the project to design a mascot. And I can tell you that opportunity to be creative saved my life from that feeling of just, yeah, heaviness, and I loved it. And the feeling of being in a project that was actually effective. The mascot got designed and used by Southend Council. The mascot costume got made. There was products and leaflets and things printed. That was absolutely amazing for me to experience that. But as I've sort of got past that, I'm now in a job that I'm in because it's relatively safe. I can do it whilst the boys are at school. I can easily attain it, but it does have that air of the mundane, and it does lack the cortisol injection that I once relied on. And yeah, it's really difficult because now I sort of really appreciate what kind of messaging do we give out to people. Because I think really the overall message we give to mums is that your job to care doesn't really matter. Caring is not valuable. And my friend, she works with elderly people, and again you see that all these lonely old people, all these people in our communities who have mental health issues, who are just living alone. And I don't know, I'm just caused to think that there's something actually insane in our society where we're encouraged to dissociate from what's really important. And now I look at it and I wonder, okay, I've been under that amount of stress for that many years. How much does this feeling of sort of instability and stress then relate to the boys and their wiring? How much of that feeling of being unsafe then contribute to the development of ADHD, of autism. I wonder, and I'm not entirely blaming myself, but I just think it's culture overall that we're encouraged to be dissociated, disconnected. Yeah, and I'm not sure what the answers are. I'm not sure what the answers are for society, but I really think that we are seeing the results of this sort of crazy society that we have created.